Welcome to the Lawless Astrology channel. My name is Dabney, and today I'm very honored to have a special guest. His name is Nick Dagan Best, and he is one of the most scholarly, researched astrologers that I know of, and he does a lot of historical content. He works a lot with the Astrology podcast with Chris Brennan, and I was so excited when he said that he would come on my little channel. So thank you, Nick. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure, Dabney. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so today we're going to talk about Saturn Neptune. We're going to talk about Saturn going into Aries. We're going to talk about Uranus and going into Gemini. So there's all these things that we're going to be talking about. But the reason why I think it's going to be very compelling is we're going to look at it kind of from a historical trend perspective. And we're just going to sort of riff on what we think is coming, what has come in the past during some of these things. And we're going to kind of look at it a little bit more holistically. But if you do get a chance to check out Nick's uh, his YouTube channel. I'm going to put a link to that. And he does do readings and he's available, which is a huge treat. Like that is not always happening. So I'm going to put his website there so you can book a reading with him. And then also, do you want to talk very briefly a little bit about your software? You're actually developing astrology software too, correct?
Yes, I'm a partner in a company called Themamundi Technologies, and we're making an astrology software. 1.0, version 1.0 is about to be released in the coming weeks. The software is called Nicepso. People can get more information about it at nicepso.com. That's NECHEPSO. And it's an astrology software that we're programming using a trained LLM model. So we're using, it's being sort of, the calculations are being done with AI, a form of AI and sharing. And yeah, there's all these really interesting sort of, you can connect it to like a practicing astrologer can use the software directly with something like Cal, like a Zoom call type feature that's embedded in the software, and also like YouTube videos can be played in the software. There's a whole social media network that we're developing alongside it called Third House, and that'll be integrated with the software. So yeah, we're doing this. We're taking the whole astrology software platform to really a new level, and it's going to be able to do a lot of things that no astrology software has been able to do up until now. So we're
So
really
did you
excited about
time
that.
that a little bit with Pluto going into Aquarius and now Gemini Uranus going into Gemini?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there was, because there are three partners in the company. I mean, there was something organic about the three of us, wanting to do something like this and coming together. My friend and fellow astrologer Patrick Watson, he and I had been doing a live stream together for about a year and a half, and we'd been talking about how we'd like to look into AI and how it could be used with astrology. What sort of yeah, what sort of boundaries could we overcome? What kind of obstacles, rather, could we overcome? It seems no matter how advanced astrology software is, there's always something you wish it could do that it can't. And then we found this programmer who was also very astrologically literate, which is rare and hard to find, but we found him. Patrick found him and connected the three of us. And so from there, yes. Did we do it because Pluto is going into Aquarius, or were we given the opportunity to do it because Pluto is in Aquarius? Is anyone's opinion, anyone's guess.
Chicken and egg, same
Yeah,
thing,
sure.
synchronicity. Yeah.
Yeah,
So, okay, well, so let's talk because we're about to have Saturn go into Aries. So
yeah,
let's start there.
sure.
And I know you did, and so there is absolutely no way. What was it? How long was your astrology podcast on the Saturn Neptune? Was it like 7 hours?
8 hours,
Eight
8 hours.
hours?
We've done it. We've done a few, and we kept like topping our record. At one point we did a 6 hour one and it was like, ooh, and And then there was a 6 hour follow up to that one, and then an 8 hour one. So I've lost track, but I think 8 hours is more or less how long we went. Yeah.
Well, I have listened to the entire thing through the course of like driving my son down to the South Bay and, like washing dishes and making dinner and stuff. So
Cool.
I've listened to it and it was amazing. We are not going to do that here, but
Okay.
I do believe that we can at least start with, let's talk about Saturn moving into Aries. You just said overcoming boundaries. That was
Yeah.
sort of
Yeah.
very Saturn in Aries. So do you want to kind of riff on what you see coming and what are some historical patterns that you're looking for?
Yeah. Well, the Saturn Neptune conjunction happens about every 36 years or so, give or take a year. The last one was in 1989. The one prior to that was 1952, 53. It sort of straddled those 2 years. And then the one before that was in 1917. And there are a bunch of different ways of looking at those periods and seeing the sort of the consistent pattern that you could draw through those times in history. And then there's some other things, going back centuries, there are some other sort of longer standing, consistent sort of themes that come up during Saturn Neptune conjunctions as well. Some of them are fairly sinister, and then some of them have, the hope and optimism embedded in them as well. So just, I mean, looking at the 20th century, the first thing I think that is worth pointing out is the previous Saturn Neptune conjunctions in the 20th century, those three ones that I outlined, all coincided very precisely with periods where there was a mass shift in how media was consumed. Um, and it's what's funny in all three cases, it's not the period when this media was invented, but it's when it suddenly became like the universal thing. And it is more of a sort of a home media thing as well. So 1917, radio already existed, but this is the year that the United States winds up getting involved in the First World War, and radio sort of takes over. It becomes this thing that people get used to listening to, I think in part because of the war. Ditto in Europe and what have you. It just becomes a habit, particularly right around that conjunction of 1917 when so much is changing at once. The Russian Revolution, America's joining the war, America and Mexico almost get into it again. All these different things go. Ireland breaks into a little civil war. All these things are happening at once, and of course, war around the world. So that radio sort of tied into that, and it would become, of course, like the cornerstone from that point onward. Families just gathered around the radio. The radio was something that society in the West and well across the globe got used to having as a sort of an anchor of information and entertainment. And then, I mean, movies existed, but movies were something that no one watched movies in their homes at this point. They listened to the radio or they went out to movies. But then in 1952, 53, at the next Saturn Neptune conjunction, television had existed. It was invented in the late 20s, and it existed in Germany and to some extent in the States in 30s and 40s. But in 52, 53, up until that point, it was still kind of a luxury, novelty kind of thing. But in 52, the King of England died, and his daughter, Elizabeth, was going to be coronated queen. So suddenly, Britain was going to have this young woman be their new monarch, and it was going to be televised. For the first time ever, they were going to televise the coronation, and so a huge percentage of the population in Great Britain went out and bought TV sets, like virtually overnight, to watch the coronation. At the same time, that exact same period, the first US election to be televised happened in 1952. And in fact, the winning candidate was Dwight Eisenhower, who had the sun in Libra, and Saturn and Neptune were conjunct his sun when he was elected president in 1952 at the first televised presidential election. And this really, so similarly, of course, Americans went out and bought TVs en masse. And by the end of the 50s, I think it's something like 90% of households have television sets, something that almost, only a few people really had at the beginning of that decade. So it is that sort of, suddenly everything changed, and that winds up changing the movie industry. The movie industry has to compete, and so they start doing full color widescreen things that you can't get on your TV. Right. So jump ahead to the next one. The next conjunction was in 1989 going into 1990. So we had the collapse of the Berlin Wall. We had Tiananmen Square. We had Nelson Mandela being released from prison, not too far from where I'm sitting now. Um, and of course, we had the first Gulf War. And all of these things contributed to a mass movement of media consumption whereby we went from watching our news at like 6 o'clock or 11 o'clock, on network television where there was a 1 hour news broadcast. We went from there to consuming that 24-hour news thing. Certainly that first Gulf War was when like America really became a CNN, centric culture. CNN had existed since 1980. Again, this thing had already existed, but the Saturn Neptune conjunction is when just everyone is now consuming this media in this fashion.
Wolf Blitzer. Remember when
Right.
everyone
Yeah,
was
yeah. No, that's exactly what made Wolf Blitzer was that first Gulf War.
right.
He became a, sort of star overnight kind of thing, or whatever star, celebrity,
No, I
whatever,
think so.
whatever,
Yeah. That
yeah,
like
whatever
yeah,
Wolf
but that
is. Yeah.
Neptunian sort of like elevation of like the cultural icon, right? A
Yeah.
cultural icon.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it was, we were coming out of a television era where there had been a time where everyone was watching the same thing. Everyone watched Johnny Carson at 11 o'clock, and then you went to work the next day, and all your coworkers had also seen the Johnny Carson show, and you could joke about it or talk about it. It was a lot more of a shared experience, and that sort of that movement to CNN was. A sort of a mirror of that, but also the beginning of the end of that, that sort of aspect to television culture, I think.
Yeah, and we've seen
Yeah.
so much disillusion and change in our media since
Right.
June was traveled through Pisces. I mean,
Yeah.
that's been like, there is no commonality. It's all kind of everywhere, right? Very Piscean.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a whole. I mean, you certainly the movement to things like podcasts and other sort of independent journalism outlets that is underway, and maybe that's all we're talking about. Because again, those have existed for over a decade, but certainly since this last election, we've seen a fairly large exodus from what remained of cable news audiences. That certainly is one consequence. I mean, everyone's just disillusioned and disgusted with them. So, that might be it in and of itself. Maybe it's right in front of our eyes. But yeah, it tends to be this really big cultural shift, and it's certainly insofar as it applies to the 20th century. That's one facet of that conjunction, I think, is how we have consumed media, how we've obtained our information, how we've grown as a digital communication global culture.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, and I know that you did a lot of research as far as Russia being
Yeah,
very
yeah.
impacted by the Saturn Neptune.
This
So,
is sure. Yeah,
yeah. So,
yeah.
is
Well,
there,
yeah,
yeah, like,
those three periods I mentioned of the conjunctions in the 20th century are easily the three most important events in Russian history in the 20th century. Maybe apart from the Second World War, which is another thing altogether, although it's still related. So, 1917, the conjunction was the Russian Revolution and the Bolsheviks taking over. 1953, Stalin died during the Saturn Neptune conjunction, and of course he had been the strong man, and really the victor of the Second World War. If you really know the history of the Second World War, it's far more of a Russian war than it is an American, a British, or even a French war. Although France was at least occupied. So his death in 1953 at the conjunction was a whole game changer in the whole Cold War thing. It changed things in the Soviet Union. It changed things for China, which had just become communist. Changed things. Eisenhower was just elected to, stand up to Stalin, and then Stalin goes and dies on him. So yeah, it sort of it changed what the Soviet Union had been up until that point. And then of course 1989 was the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the ultimate falling of the Soviet Union. So yeah, and the thing about Saturn Neptune is if you go further back, there are maybe three or four conjunctions, usually three Saturn Neptune conjunctions per century. But you can go back several hundred years, quite a few hundred years, and it seems like every Saturn Neptune conjunction, or virtually all of them, happened to coincide with really important turning points in Russian history over the centuries, which is, I mean, the kind of thing I find interesting for a number of reasons. Number one, for people who like to look at like the charts of countries, looking at something like a Saturn Neptune conjunction cycle the way I do and going centuries back in Russian history, this is an astrology that covers different regimes in Russian history. You can go from the imperial era of the czars to the Soviet Union, communist republic, and then to the current federation and whatever might follow that. So yeah, this is, in other words, this is an astrology that really transcends just the notion of a national chart, which can be useful in a more short-term context. But if you really want to look at an astrology that spans centuries, then obviously you have to detach from national charts, and this is a really beautiful way to do it. And the way the Saturn Neptune conjunction parallels Russian history really is awe-inspiring. I can't possibly be, too hyperbolic about it. It's really amazing if you know it. If you know the history and you see the conjunctions, it's dazzling.
Yeah, and even one of the things that you guys brought up on that podcast was about like the Bolshevik ballet and how
Mm,
ballet, became very emblematic of Russia. At least when you and I were growing up, like that's,
sure. Oh, yeah,
Baryshnikov,
far
like,
before that.
everything
Yeah.
and how that, is just so beautifully Neptune and Saturn, right? Like this like artistic expression,
Yeah.
but the discipline, like we have to be disciplined. And so that was a really cool observation that one of you made. I don't remember. I think it was
Yeah,
your
it
research.
was me. It
Yeah.
was me. Yeah. You know, um,
That really
yeah.
struck me. I just wanted to tell you, like, that
Oh,
sat
thank
with
you.
me. And like, I felt like that was the perfect expression of Neptune and Saturn energy together because they're such
Yeah,
weird partners. And
it
so, how
is.
do you kind of explain their fusing?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll give you the breakdown on that. So, St. Petersburg was founded in 1703 during a Saturn Neptune conjunction in Aries. This is like at the very north of Russia, across the board, across the little sea from the North Sea from Finland and Sweden. And Sweden had that property, and Peter the Great took it over, and he built a city there, brought all these Italian architects and builders to make it look like Venice. I was really blessed to see St. Petersburg in 2016. I had a feeling that, I better see it now or I'll never see it. And it really is like a Venice of the North, this beautiful sort of Roman inspired city in the north. But yeah, the city was founded during a Saturn Neptune conjunction, the last one we ever had in Aries in 1703. And then the very next Saturn Neptune conjunction in the early 1740s, I guess, the first ballet school in St. Petersburg was founded by the empress at the time. This was a period in history where you had like three different women were in charge of Russia in a row. The last one being Catherine the Great, and then her son hated her so much he passed a law saying women could never be in charge of Russia again,
Lovely.
which would be a problem during the revolution when the Tsar had four healthy daughters and then a young boy who was a hemophiliac, but of course he's supposed to be the heir to the throne. I digress. So the
I
the
love
Saturn,
Russian history. It's
right?
fascinating.
No, I mean it's all operatic. So you had that first ballet school founded in St. Petersburg, and then the next Saturn Neptune conjunction, 36 years later in the 1770s, Catherine the Great, who was now in charge, she started the first ballet school that was in Moscow. So both the first school in St. Petersburg and the first one in Moscow, the two major Russian cities, both of those ballet schools, both of which have a sort of immense reputation
Yeah.
of their own. So they're both these massive institutions, and they were both founded during those conjunctions. And yeah, you're right. It is an art form that really lends itself to that Saturn Neptune, the sense that one gets when you combine those two planets, those seemingly really incongruent planets, the sort of the discipline and the hardness of Saturn with the sort of the grace and the illusion of Neptune. It seems like an odd pairing, but ballet is a really powerful, sort of a symbol of how those forces combine.
So interesting. Just while you're talking, just like picturing Russia and picturing, it is a harsh land. It's very
Yeah.
Saturnian, just the weather and the survival of it. And so it's interesting to think of like how intertwined that Neptune and Saturn is with the land.
Yes. Yeah. When we were in St. Petersburg, we were there in July, which is a time when there's only an hour of night, an hour of darkness at night. And of course, during their winters, you'll get very, very short days of, a couple hours at most. This is really far north. I'm from Montreal, which is 45 degrees north. This is, I forget, might be 60. It's really far north, even relative to Montreal. But that's the thing when you're talking about ballet or the sort of the Russian aristocratic culture, these grand balls. When I can attest to, when you come from a real, northern place like that, you have to have good parties, because there's nothing else to do. And so that is sort of that feeds into that environment feeds into just how I think the Russian aristocrats lived. Um,
Or even the people, like you think about Russian vodka is, a survival, like it's part of
sure.
their culture, right? I mean,
Yeah.
and also just like living in those very northern areas, there is kind of this like otherworldliness, the Neptunian kind of like
Yeah.
madness, but also like creativity and, kind of illusion. So it's really
Yeah.
interesting how I think
It,
countries have their sort of narratives woven in.
it is. I mean, I think that there's other facets to it as well. Like for instance, I think of Neptune as being very much the planet of the global collective as we know it. When Neptune was discovered in 1846, this was right at the time that the United States won the war with Mexico, where it took Texas and Arizona and California. Um, so suddenly the United States was bicoastal. Suddenly the United States was also partly Latin American, like virtually overnight. And then furthermore, right at that same time, right as the United States took California, gold was found near where San Francisco is today, and that caused the gold rush. And so suddenly you had all these people from back east in the United States going west as like to find the American dream, so to speak, to reinvent their lives. The same reason anyone goes to California or goes west from the east. There's this sense that you're transforming yourself and making that journey. There's something very iconic and very American about it. But what's interesting, at that same time, there were all these revolutions happening in Europe in 1848, and so a lot of people left their European countries and moved to the States. But they were new Europeans that hadn't lived in the States before. They weren't British or Dutch or German or French. They were Serbian or Polish or Hungarian or Italian. And that really sort of made this melting pot, or you started to see it. And the Opium Wars had just happened in China. So you have Chinese coming in now. So you're really starting to see the world that we recognize where, you can be from anywhere in the globe and wind up living anywhere.
So let's
So
talk.
going back to Russia, I'm sorry, going back to Russia, Russia is a country that really struggles with like, are we European or are we not? Or, there's this whole sort of what's the word I'm looking for? You know, sort of like a split personality in a sense. Like when Peter the Great founded St. Petersburg and designed it in this Roman model, the idea was to, you know, bring Russia to the West. But then you've had all this pushback. Like Putin is certainly someone who would you know, not see things the same way. So and this goes back, like, you know, talk about these Saturn Neptune conjunctions. You can go back to a Saturn Neptune conjunction in the 1200s when the Russians finally fought off the Mongols who had occupied you know, Russia for quite a long time, which is not something that happened in the rest of Europe. And it's along with the climate, it's part of what make the Russians what they are, a bit more sort of very suspicious of being very paranoid about being invaded.
Right, right, because it is sort of this dividing line between the West and the East.
Yeah.
And it,
And a
but
wide
it,
open plain on all sides. So they feel very vulnerable. The Mongols could just ride in. Napoleon could just come in. The Hitler just went in. You know, when they burned down Moscow, Napoleon invaded. They burned down Moscow. That was the same way they used to fight off the Mongols. The Mongols would invade. They'd burn down Moscow and they'd run off and you know, let the Mongols starve. So yeah, that's part of like their history really has shaped them and everything that's happening there today. You can fathom how it takes them. They're still fighting the Mongols in a way. There's some kind of like, you know, psychic anxiety passed down through the ages, I think.
yeah, no,
Saturn
I'm
Neptune.
definitely I'm interested in epigenetics and like how trauma can inform even, you know, people's lived
Right.
experience today versus like what happened centuries ago, you know, like it sort
Well,
of changes.
yeah, I mean, virtually all of us are descendants of people who had some kind of experience in the Second World War, First World War, all you know, all of the above. You name it, and yeah, we you know we do carry these. I mean, I know my grandfather only died. Actually, my grandfather died when I was in St. Petersburg in 2016. He was 98, and he carried all this you know, suffering that he had. You know, experienced during the war, and that's virtually universal, no matter where you are. I'm here in South Africa. Lots of people have, you know, that same
It's
heritage that you and I have in Canada, the United States. I mean, we were all involved, or our ancestors were all involved, and we do all carry that stuff with us, no doubt about it. You know, if not in our bodies and our stories, but I think yeah, it's you know, some of it is this trauma, this anxiety that we you know that we um, keep piling on ourselves,
so
you know?
it's interesting how, you know, each country kind of does have its own version of that, right? And so
Yes.
in America here, the US, there, you know, there is sort of this, we're a very young country, but suddenly like had a lot of power. and and you know, we are pioneers, like people, you know, escaping trauma from other
Yeah.
places, wanting to come here, wanting to pioneer, make a new life for themselves. That's very Aries, even though in the US chart, really the only Aries is that the Chiron. So there is sort of this, and then also a lot of people brought in without, you know, through slavery, without their
Yeah.
consent, and then having to like make their way in this world and a very survivalist kind of um world.
Hmm.
So now here we're entering Saturn and Aries. What are
Yeah.
some of the things that you are looking for with Saturn and Aries? Um,
Well,
based on
it definitely is. It tends to be a hard time for U.S. presidents. The last time was during the mid late 90s when Bill Clinton was exposed in the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Um, you know, it didn't his famously his popularity went up after the scandal, but it did, you know, damage his brand, so to speak, and his legacy.
just a little
The
bit.
Just a little bit. The time before that was right at the time I was born. I have natal Saturn in Aries. When Lyndon Johnson decided not to run, you know, for re-election because of the failure in the Vietnam War, in particular the Tet Offensive. So that was a fall from grace. Like if you know anything about Lyndon Johnson's life, his whole life he was obsessed with being the president. So for him to be the guy who says, you know what, I messed up, I'm stepping down. is just wild. Like if you think of all, every man who's ever been the U.S. president, you would almost think he would have been the least likely of any of them to ever do that. Because not even the current guy grew up wanting to be president, every minute of his life. So, that's kind of remarkable. Then the time before that was in the mid late 1930s when Franklin Roosevelt was fighting with the Supreme Court over New Deal legislation, and he was threatening to pack the court, like add more judges to the court. And it was for a guy who was, he was a U.S. president who was very popular. Served famously elected 4 times. And when he was losing this court battle, when he was fighting this battle with the Supreme Court, he had just won. I think it still is the biggest majority anyone's ever won in a presidential election in 1936, his first reelection. But yeah, this whole fight with the Supreme Court did damage his momentum, and sort of what he ultimately had to do was just wait for these judges to retire, the ones who were in his way, which they wound up doing after Saturn did leave Aries. But it started off with him,
Like,
relative to his whole presidency, it was definitely the period where he struggled most and where it was the most precarious, and he couldn't count that on being popular after that. And then the presidency before that was Taft. Who was a one-term president who, was largely considered a failure, and in the back pocket of big corporations and what have you. And so yeah, he lost his bid for reelection, and never wanted to be president. He had always wanted to be a Supreme Court justice. So later on, Woodrow Wilson, who beat him in the election, made him a Supreme Court justice, and he got to die being a Supreme Court justice. But even he would have told you he wasn't a very good president, and he wasn't very successful. So yeah, in the 20th century, the Saturn in Aries tends to be, even for, think of the people I'm discussing, especially FDR, Lyndon Johnson, and Bill Clinton. You're talking about some pretty like big shots, certainly, like LBJ and Clinton are in particular, the kind of men that you think of as being kind of big shots, if that means anything. Sort of larger than life personality, ego driven. They're not your Jimmy Carter. They're not your Harry Truman. They're sort of wannabe alpha males, or Lyndon was probably AAA alpha male, but in the worst way. But yeah, in other words, like their sort of downfalls are that much more humbling, because they are, they were immensely popular and confident and seemingly indestructible.
okay. So when I look at, what's happening currently in my country,
Yeah.
I to some degree am looking forward to the Saturn and Aries, because I think that there can be a correction. I think that there can be some checks. I think there can be what you're talking about, a little bit of a fall from grace. It's like if you're too much hubris, like Saturn's going to pull you back and bring you back down to earth. However, it can also be what we're seeing, maybe accelerated, which is a rise in authoritarianism and
Yeah.
an even larger crackdown. Do you have any thoughts? I mean, I think the two can probably exist at the same time, and it's hard to have an exact reflection on history because we're looking at all different outer planet
Yeah.
energies. But I'm just curious about your read on like where you instinctively think things might be going.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think you're right to a point that Saturn Neptune involves some element, if not course correct, there'll probably be some
Well,
course
I was just
correction, but
talking Saturn Aries, but I
yeah,
guess
yeah.
I can't
Okay,
ignore
Saturn
that.
and Aries, yeah. Yeah, I mean, to that effect, Saturn Neptune conjunctions tend to be very clarifying. The sort of like the smoke clears. It's not the Neptunian fog. It's like hyper reality. Like if you think of it's like seeing something you've never seen. Like even the example of the coronation on TV in England. Until 1953. No one in England had ever seen a royal coronation unless you were like a lord or an aristocrat. Like it was a really exclusive affair. And suddenly the whole world could see it. And that's, I mean, that's more of a symbolic issue, but that is very Saturn Neptune. It tends to be like, or think of like the Gulf War. We were suddenly watching war on TV. You're in your bedroom watching,
Watching bombs.
watching
Right.
rockets get fired. Vietnam, sure, you watched Vietnam like on the nightly news at 6 o'clock. Walter Cronkite would say, this many people were killed and this is what happened. And you saw maybe 3 minutes of footage. And that was like a step in the middle. But the Gulf War really was a thing. I mean, I remember the night it started. I was shooting pool at a bar with my friend, and it's on TV while we're shooting bar, and like, oh, a war's just broken out, and we're shooting pool and drinking beer. That was a whole new kind of experience. So I do think one thing about the Saturn Neptune coming up is I do think we will come back to a closer version of a shared reality. It's not like we're going to agree, but at least we're going to be disagreeing on a similar set of facts without the sort of wild, we're
Right. Like the
it
right
seems
now
like
reality
we're not
is
even having the same conversation, like we're coming back like, okay, we're still arguing and things are still kind of dark and sinister, but at least we're arguing over the same truth more or less. And we're on sort of the same page. You can start to see some of that coming about now, but it's really what I've been expecting. Is at least that, in whatever way any of us have been deceiving ourselves or deceiving others, it just becomes that much harder to do so.
okay.
Um, and and I do think, yeah, it's typically very humbling for U.S. presidents, and that's in the short term what I'm expecting. But in terms of like course correction, we have to look at Saturn Neptune in a larger context in U.S. history, which is the transit of Uranus through Gemini, which has a really powerful relationship in U.S. history. I think it's really the fundamental planetary cycle in U.S. history. In some ways, I would even say the Uranus, amongst the other things it signifies in astrology, Uranus signifies the United States of America. It was discovered in 1781 as the Revolutionary War was ending, and it signifies so many of the cultural and technological changes that have happened in the world that have emerged from the United States. And when I say this, I mean this in a way that if I had Ronald Reagan and Muammar Gaddafi sitting on either side of me, they would both agree with whatever I mean by that. So, in other words, like, the super haters and the super lovers, whatever that shared idea of what the United States has done in the world, that is very Uranian. So, just a quick recap. The cycle of Uranus is 84 years. It takes 84 years to go through the 12 signs of the zodiac. It spends 7 years in each of those signs. And so going back 3 cycles of 84 years, whenever Uranus has been in Gemini for that 7 year period, it has always coincided with a really important turning point in American history that at the end of which the country winds up redefining itself and really kind of becoming a new country, like same flag, same constitution, but a new country, reinvented in some way. So the first one is 1774 to 1781, the beginning of the Revolutionary War to the end, perfectly bookended. 84 years later, it's 1858 to 1865, from the Lincoln-Douglas debates all the way through the Civil War to the end. And then the third time was 1941 to 1949, from Pearl Harbor right up until the period just before the Soviet Union got an atomic bomb. So in other words, the period where the United States became a superpower, a nuclear bomb, something entirely new, and was the only superpower. That was the Uranus and Gemini period. So these were all wars that the United States was involved in. And at the end of these wars, the United States was a completely new place that was almost unimaginable when those wars had begun,
Right.
when you really think about it. None of them seemed inevitable. The last thing the United States was trying to become in the late 1930s was a global superpower. Like it was trying very hard to be anything but that. So at least technologically. So with all that in mind, Uranus is going into Gemini in June. And, lots of astrologers know this history. I wrote a book about it 12 years ago, but I was not the first astrologer to identify it by any means. It was something that was discussed back in the turn of the century before the Second World War. The likes of Evangeline Adams and Luke Broughton wrote about it. So it's something that astrologers have known and we always look towards, but we've been looking toward 2025 for a long time because Uranus is going into Gemini this year. It'll be there until 2032. And the Saturn, Neptune, and Aries period, or just the Saturn and Aries period, is one chapter of a larger story that's going to be taking place, or I think is going to be taking place over the course of this period. And I think like the real course correction it isn't likely, wrapped up in a neat bow in 2026 or 2027. I think, it's somewhere around 2032. And between now and then, it doesn't all have to do with, with Donnie. I think Donnie is just one chapter of a larger narrative, and that's the one that's before us now. But it's where things go from there, and for the country to emerge again, redefined in the way it always has been. Yeah, I think we're in for a 7-year stretch. I honestly do.
Okay. I love, I've watched some of your work about the Uranus Gemini and the Uranus return in the US, really, which is what this is.
Yeah.
That is the thing that does give me a little bit of a hope about like not being in an authoritarian regime,
Yeah.
because Uranus and Gemini is not really there for that. And I don't know that Pluto and Aquarius will be necessarily either.
Well, I
Thoughts?
mean, all three of those wars I just mentioned, there was always some premise of fighting tyranny. Now, to be fair, during the Civil War, I mean, the the people who say they're fighting tyranny are the Confederates, but it is a big part of their worldview. And obviously slavery is a tyranny. If nothing else is. But yeah, in the Revolutionary War, in the Second World War, I mean, it is something that people feel they are facing, and almost sort of like, not unlike now, it's something that, oh, all of a sudden we really have to deal with this. Like, we didn't want to, we were enjoying our lives being free people, and now we got to deal with this. That's this thing that's fallen on our laps. But yeah, I think there is reason to be hopeful in the long term. It's just that the issue is right now. I mean, the crazy. Okay, here's another Saturn Neptune thread for you. When
Okay.
when Dwight Eisenhower was elected in 1952 and inaugurated in 53, he appointed these two brothers, the Dulles brothers. One became his Secretary of State, the older brother, and the younger one, Alan Dulles, was put in charge of the CIA. The CIA was only about 5 years old at this point. It had been Truman had allowed it to be formed, although he would come to regret it. But now, when Alan Dulles took over the CIA in 53, this is when a lot of what are now very infamous incidents happened, where the CIA was involved in overthrowing foreign governments, and a lot of sort of interference and bolstering a lot of other authoritarian regimes. I mean, by the summer of 1953, within a few months, it was happening in Iran, where there was a I won't get it too much into it, but they basically made sure the Shah, basically a king, was kept in place because he was sort of their puppet, and they could, maintain control over the region. And of course, that would blow up later with the Iranian Revolution. That's something we're still coping with now. And it would go on to like Guatemala and a bunch of other Latin American countries and Indonesia. But what would happen is that the same sort of pattern played out in these different maneuvers and these different counter-revolutionary movements that happened. Also here in Africa, come to think of it, they also happen. And part of the CIA would put in some kind of authoritarian puppet that they could control. But the other thing that would happen is dissidents would start disappearing. And this is the reason I have this apprehension now, even before, these unfortunate students and people protesting, the war in Gaza.
People with
We can
tattoos
see,
being shipped to
yeah,
foreign
we can see
blocks.
that, but it keeps going. Like, I mean, right now it's quote unquote, the seemingly egregious, special cases or what have you. But eventually it comes to a point where, yeah, some college kid goes out to get a quart of milk or whatever, and no one ever sees them again. And in places like Argentina and Chile, the young people were disappearing by the thousands. So there is, like, in the short term, there is this concern, and especially with regard to being, openly contrarian to the government. And let's face it, this is the United States of America. Love it or leave it, people say what they think. It's not. It's a heavy duty task to get 300 million people to shut the hell up and play along. It's never been tried there. Not to say, I mean, Chileans, Argentinians, they're strong, vocal, literate people who fought back, but it takes time, and not everyone makes it.
Yeah.
We just had this Venus retrograde transit in Aries, which reminds me of Argentina in 1977, when in March, when that same Venus retrograde in Aries was happening. That was when all these mothers in Buenos Aires of disappeared young people got together and formed this powerful organization that demanded that the government, be accountable for the disappearance of their kids. But even that movement, took almost a decade to really get any real response. So I mean, it's a struggle. I have no doubt that people in the States don't want this, and will fight back. And even you can tell a lot of the people who voted for this regime are getting buyer's remorse more and more. So
Yeah,
yeah, it's a
I
matter of
think it's my
snatching it back.
nature to want to find the silver lining, to find the optimism, but I do also believe in being realistic, which is it's a really tough time, and people are feeling that. And I think not enough people, I think, are realizing like the potential of what can happen. I think there is this sort of American exceptionalism where like, well, that
Yeah.
won't happen here, and I think there's sort of a delusion still rooted that that can't happen here, but it can, and it is. And that's
Mm.
the thing that I guess, to your point, the long-term optimism, I do believe my in my heart, I want to believe that we will come out of this. And I hope it is not the full Uranian cycle of Uranus and Gemini. But I think it's really good, and it's to hear this sort of historical perspective. And sometimes we have to come up against these harder things in our lives to make progress, to make things better, to take that next step.
Yeah, I mean, most of our ancestors have had to deal with this or worse. I mean, it's more the norm than not. The fact that I've managed to live into my mid 50s, before I had to face something of this, proximity, is saying something. Yeah, I mean, I think that, the Donnie chapter is just one part of this story, and the other part of it is when the inauguration happened in January, the sun was conjunct Pluto at 0 Aquarius. Presidential inaugurations always happen when the sun is at 0 Aquarius. Since actually 1937, the first term was the one when Roosevelt would wind up fighting with the Supreme Court over the court packing. But that's always the case. But for the first time, the sun and Pluto were conjunct at 0 Aquarius. In 2024, the sun and Pluto had made their conjunction at 29 Capricorn. So this conjunction on January 20th, 2025 was the first one in Aquarius since the 1790s, since the days of the French Revolution. So with that in mind, this was another reason why I thought Trump was a shoo-in in the election, along with the Uranus and Gemini thing, which really ties into his chart very strongly. When he announced Vance was going to be his VP candidate.
Mm.
Trump's natal Pluto is conjunct Vance's sun in Leo. So they have a Sun Pluto conjunction in their synastry, and they're the two guys who were inaugurated on January 20th. And Pluto is very much a planet of a range. It takes something small and makes it big, something big make it small. Take someone poor, make them rich. Say someone rich, make them poor. It's very you come from the bottom and you rise to the very top. There's always like some really dramatic shift of some kind. A homeless person finding a winning lottery ticket, or a CEO losing all of their money on a gambling debt. Very, rags to riches, riches to rags. And think about these two guys with their hands on the Bible or whatever it was on that day. One of them is this, born millionaire, silver spoon, never had
One
to
of
work
them
a day in his
hovering
life.
his hand over the Bible. Let me just
Right,
interject
right, right.
there.
And then,
Sorry.
and then the other guy is identifies as a hillbilly, even if he's sort of a suburban variant. In other words, Vance is your classic sort of like the small little inconsequential nobody who's going to be someone Plutonian in the end. And that's where I think this goes. I think Donnie never wanted this job. I think like he ran this time so he didn't have to go to jail. And he can make some money on the side, and he's got a new plane, and that's that. But I think it's really it's this next guy that we're really going to be spending most of our time dealing with.
I have not looked much at his chart.
Okay. Well,
Do
let me
you
tell you one.
tell me
Let me
some,
tell you
tell
one
me
thing
something?
about him. Yeah.
Okay.
Um, he's born in August of 1984, and he's got Mars and Saturn in Scorpio. Half of all people born in 1984 have Mars and Saturn in Scorpio, but he does. And wouldn't you know, RFK Jr., who's born 30 and a half years earlier in January of 1954, also has Mars and Saturn co-present in Scorpio. And next spring, March, April, something like that, I forget the exact period, Mars is going to go into Aries, and it's going to be co-present with Saturn. My expectation right now is that those two Mars Saturn guys are in some kind of like standoff, if you will. You know, uh, um, they're both angling for the hot seat, because it's either become vacant or is clearly about to be, or at the very least, like the person who does occupy it is even less interested in doing anything than they are now.
Right.
So that's where I say, and I do think in the end Vance is the guy who even over RFK is another one like Donnie, some big powerful rich guy. The idea is Vance is the Plutonian guy who comes up from the ground, from Appalachia, and takes over this very powerful seat. I think that's going to be the story here.
Yes. Very interesting. And I'm gonna have to do more on his chart. I'm just thinking, because you are an encyclopedia of knowledge, which I am so impressed by, that you can retain all these facts. I always have to have notes when it comes to this sort of thing. So the fact that you're not looking at any notes and you've just got this encyclopedia in your mind is amazing. But that also then brings me back to the kind of technology. And I know we should probably wrap up soon, but I'm I'm loving this sort of
Mm,
bigger picture threads that are being woven. So we've got Vance, who is Peter Thiel's guy, right? Like
yeah,
the tech oligarchy is also playing, so we've got the Project 2025 guys, and we've got the tech oligarchy, and we've got a lot of other
right.
people who are behind the scenes, kind of controlling what's
And
actually
and
happening.
Donnie's the glue, right? I
He's
mean, if
just playing
Donnie's,
golf and and then we
but
have like the Miller, right? Like, which is a
yeah,
whole other sort of faction of just like pure, like cuckoo, El Salvador, Libya, like that whole,
yeah,
I really feel like that's that dude, right?
yeah, yeah,
He has zero charisma. thus far, Vance has zero charisma, and it's fascinating.
Yeah, although a hell of a lot more than Stephen Miller, but that is saying
Right.
nothing.
That is saying nothing.
I
Exactly.
mean, the only, I mean, the thing else, you know, Miller's very mask off. But to be honest, we don't really know what Vance
Right.
thinks. You know, I mean, he was vocally anti-Trump in 2019. You know, probably is not racist, or at least not as racist as, you know, everyone around him. I'm guessing. Well, I guess you could marry someone who's not white and still be a racist. But you know, he was in the chat in Hegseth's you know
Slight
chat
voice of
about.
reason, just a little.
Yeah, no, he was, you know, hey, do we really want to do? I mean, you know, I'm not going to be the guy's, you know, stand by any measure, but there is this slight hint that he might be sane and just is keeping his mouth shut. Who knows? I
Well,
probably not. I
incredibly
mean,
opportunistic. Um,
yeah, yeah,
Clearly,
yeah,
like from my observation, more from not the chart, because really haven't looked at his chart, and I know I probably should.
yeah,
Um, doesn't know himself very well, and I don't know where that is in the chart, but or he's very good at keeping it. Maybe it is that Scorpio, the Mars Saturn in Scorpio. Maybe it's just,
yeah. Strategic.
catapulted, right? He was
Yeah,
catapulted to fame from liberal, educated people who bought his book, right? I mean,
yeah,
that's that like that he was made by those people. I mean, and then
yeah. And I mean, he made himself. It's not even his real name, right? He's had like three names. You know, um, um, I'm not sure there's been another president who didn't use their birth name, not offhand that I can remember. Um,
yeah, and he's
so
slippery too, right? Like, because like he helped Trump get elected by
yeah, yeah,
going
yeah.
on Rogan and sounding
I'm
rational.
yeah, I'm not trying to glaze him by any means, but I'm talking about him in the same sentence as Stephen Miller, RFK, and Donnie, in which case definitely in the you know F Mary kill thing, this is a
Right.
scenario. That's the one you know that's gonna be the Mary one, you know. Yeah, in that company, that's all I can say. In that company, he's the one I would, you know, have to go with. Much like if you're stuck in a prison cell and you have to you get to choose whose girlfriend you're going to be, you know, you go with the one that you think is going to be the lead. Or like Donnie himself said, Donnie understood. There's one thing I've always agreed with. I too would rather be electrocuted than eaten by a shark. And so that's what JD is. He's being electrocuted rather than being eaten by the shark. There you go. Perfect analogy.
A very
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
rational thing to campaign on, by the way.
It's a
So
concept so simple, even Donnie understands it.
true. It's true.
Yeah.
Okay, well that's so I think, but then that also helps us bring us back to this where there, you said the fog clears and there is kind of a coming
Yeah.
together and there's more of a common enemy versus, or at least like you understand the
A
enemy or
common,
like
yeah. I think it's
common facts, you said.
a common reality.
Common reality.
I think, you know, some of it is going to be the realities of climate change. Another facet of Saturn Neptune is things that were very valuable are suddenly worthless, and vice versa. If you were celebrating Christmas in your beautiful beachfront Malibu house a few months ago, now you have like dust on a beach and no insurance will cover what you've lost. A lot of that is going to be happening. So it becomes harder to talk about climate change as a fiction if, you know, more places are burning or flooding with more frequency and more severity. And, you know, even if there are people who are saying it's not man-made, if it's just happening everywhere all the time, you still have a reality to deal with. And then there might be just, things about, you know, some of the other you know, conspiracies that have dogged culture and politics over the past decade and beyond. And yeah, just, you know, sort of, again, everyone just having a closer relationship to a shared reality than we've had for some time, even if we still have very different, you know, worldviews or beliefs about how things should go forward. At least we're sort of arguing in the same physical plane.
Yeah, it's a lot less interesting to complain about a trans person in the sports 4 states away when you can't pay your mortgage,
Yeah,
or,
yeah, yeah,
like, you're facing food shortages or something like
yeah.
that. And I don't predict any of that kind of thing, but I do predict some harsher realities for us all.
Yeah, I mean, I've read history books about famines. There was one in the Ukraine in when it was called the Ukraine in the 30s. There've been a few in India and what have you, certainly in Africa, and I mean, they're gruesome. They automatically involve cannibalism and just horrible things happen, and so you never want to wish that on anyone. Um, Look, astrologers are supposed to be constructive and helpful, and that's always been the MO that I've operated under. When COVID happened, there was an interesting cultural shift in that astrology audiences were saying, "Hey, why didn't you warn us about this, astrologers?" And it was a good point because, I mean, astrologers, we knew amongst ourselves, like, ooh, look at that gnarly triple conjunction coming up in early 2020. We were talking about it years before. But we weren't going out to our podcast audiences or writing in our Mountain Astrologer articles about how, nasty
Pandemic's
2020
coming.
looked. Yeah.
Right.
And so some people felt like, the astrologers had dropped the ball. Um, and since then, and that was the same year in 2020 that with Biden's election victory, I suddenly realized, oh, Donnie is going to win the next one. Because Donnie was born with the Sun conjunct Uranus and the North Node right at a lunar eclipse. So I always knew, and I've known his chart for years, and I knew like, wow, this guy has like the most American chart I've ever seen. And when he was running in 2016, I didn't think he would win because I was kind of confused. I'm like, why is he running now? This is a 2024 guy. This isn't a 2016 guy. And I'm like, no, this kid, something has to be wrong. Maybe he inspired, like, I couldn't fathom the like winning, losing, winning thing. It's only happened once before in American history. Yeah, it was a lack of imagination because I knew like this is a 2024 guy. And so as soon as Biden won in 2020, then I was like, oh, that's how this is going to happen. He's going to get elected in 2024, and right before Uranus goes into Gemini, and that's going to be the thing that I'm expecting, the Uranus and Gemini cyclical upheaval that always happens in the US. So that seems to be what's happening here. And because of that, um, I had some inkling that Donnie would be, a little more sinister this time around. 47 wasn't going to be just like the funny, crazy tweeting guy of that 45 was. That this would be graver. And to some degree, I expected this sort of authoritarian thing. But even I'm having expected everything, even I'm going. I can't believe this is happening. Um, astrology only helps you so much. I think my point being, I really apologize that I've had to say such harsh and somewhat dark sounding things. And I do hope, I'll be happy to be wrong. I'll be happy to apologize, sincerely and heartfelt if I've exaggerated the scope of the near future I think we're facing. It would be a reward and very comforting to be wrong. But I think especially because there is a historical precedent, because everything that's happening in the country right now are resemble things that have happened in other countries under the auspices of the CIA. Like there is a game plan, there is a way this plays out every single time, and the way I've outlined it tends to be the consistent thing. So I think it's just worth people understanding this. And I guess in this day and age, I mean, everything is so grim and scary. I mean, people, the news broadcasts openly talking about, the potential of nuclear war, like as a real possibility, more than when I was a kid, when it was supposedly so scary in the Cold War. So, in that environment, I guess, what am I supposed to do? Tell everyone to just, trust and keep with the light. I mean, we got to survive. We got to live, and we got to be realistic about the times we're living in. So, with that in mind, I've taken the liberty to speak my mind, albeit it's not a pretty picture. Lots of us, are going to have happy, fulfilled lives that are somewhat inconvenienced by history. Some of us are going to be robbed of that chance, and I think it's just terrible that that's the case. And yeah, but on the other end of this, I think there's hope. But it's just, how do we get through it? How many of us make it through? There's a lot of injustice before we get, I think, to that point where we're really
Think
putting
it's
things back
important
together.
to be honest. I think it's important as astrologers to say, like, this isn't
Yeah.
an easy path. And I did a video about the book, The Fourth Turning. And
Oh,
I
yeah.
don't know if you've ever read that book, but
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
crazy correlations with this kind of Uranian cycle we're in as well. And sort of, if you take a more spiritual kind of step back, which is because I do some pretty spiritual astrology, but it's not the kind of new age,
Hmm.
manifest everything will be
Sure.
okay. It's more just like the big picture. And the big picture is like these cycles happen because humans have lessons they have to learn because it's far enough away from the last major crisis. And so
Mm.
people have forgotten how devastating it is.
It really
And
is. Wow.
you and I, Gen X, like it's funny we're talking about the next president likely being a millennial. Like we just got completely skipped over, and that's a lot of what has happened in the past as well. Um, and
Hmm.
like, and we are the survivors. We're the people that, historically are the ones that tell the tale because we had that sort of, you know, boxed in between two giant generations that were sort of the chosen ones. And so that was fascinating to me as I dug into that sort of historical lens as well, that like sometimes this is just what you have to go through to progress in your evolution of being a human.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not pretty, and you there's a book about the Cambodian genocide,
Hmm.
and it very much in so many ways, like when I read that book, the actual experience, it was so mortifying as a mother, feeling like what these people went through, and then seeing what's happening now in the Middle East. And so, just to know that this is, and then, we didn't even know what was happening in Rwanda when it was happening in Rwanda. So
Yeah.
we've been lucky enough to not have this kind of dark human side of life. But, you
Yeah.
know, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that Cambodian genocide, there was in the train of events leading up to that happening, there was CIA involvement as well, because of course it's on the border with Vietnam, and there would be rebels going into Cambodia to hide, and so that there would be bombing, and then they'd go into overthrow the government, and well, it was the king at the time, who would later become I think, a president of Cambodia after, after all the killing had been done. But yeah, it's another example of how these things can just unfurl. I mean, I think that's the other thing is like Donnie's just one activator of a sequence of events that no one can control and sort of have to play themselves out.
Yeah, and the less conscious that we are as a society, the more apt we are to play out the darker
Yeah.
expression of these planetary energies. And so, I mean, I guess the only thing that we as individuals can do is play into the higher, our best angels during this time. That's what we can hold on to. But I appreciate your historical perspective, and I
Well,
do
thank you.
appreciate that you are a human encyclopedia. Is that what have you been called this before? I
The
assume.
human ephemeris, the human ephemeris, because because I have the ephemeris memorized. Yeah, I
No,
mean, I'm
you
not
do
yet.
not.
Yeah, oh yeah,
Okay.
not
Have
the
you
moon or
always had this brain?
not the moon or Mercury, but I can tell you what sign Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto were in pretty much for any date between now and the mid 1700s.
Wow. That
Yeah.
is, I wish I could borrow a tiny bit
Or,
of that. I
but Dabney, it's not that hard.
I
I'm
think
not
it's
a,
not that
I'm not,
hard for you.
Well, no, I mean it did take a lot of work, so to speak, but the work was really just being fascinated with astrology to the degree where I wanted to know everything I knew about the world. I wanted to understand the astrology of it. I think it's a very doable thing. Um, and it certainly it lends itself for anyone who's really serious about astrology to read the ephemeris like a book and to really like look at those different periods and what was happening and anything you know about history, even if you're not a big historian, any event that you know, go and look at the chart of it and try and learn as much about the astrology of it as you can. And it's an exercise that just helps you grow as as an astrologer and as a thinking person. Yeah, it's a really worthwhile task and like an objective that is very achievable. If you're
I will
if
not be
you're
reading the ephemeris, but I will be taking your advice because I do love history and I do love historical patterns and I do love looking at the charts of historical
right.
events. So I do think you have a unique brain. I think you may underestimate that the rest of us do not have the exact same brain, but that does not mean that I don't have my own gifts. But I am
Well,
so impressed with your work every time I see a video with you on it. I can't wait to click on it. So the fact that you
no,
came on
thank you.
the channel is very exciting. And
Well, thank you for having me. I
yeah,
think your remark about Gen X really struck me because it's funny. It occurred to me that Gen X are sort of like the Canadians of generations. A really small, powerless entity next to this big, all-encompassing entity that swallows all the energy. So yeah, the Boomers are the Americans and the Gen X are the Canadians, I guess. In that picture, and being a Canadian Gen Xer, I'm that much more the observer, that much more just someone who's watching, observing, but doesn't have a lot of stake in it. I mean, I have a stake in that. I want everyone to live good, fruitful lives. That's a big stake for me. But yeah, I'm still
well,
on the
look at
side
you,
to
but
some
that's
degree.
the very Gen X that like everyone's like the elbows out. Like that's very Gen X too. Just like, okay, you guys do your own crazy, but
Yeah,
I'm focusing on me. I will survive. I don't need you. Um,
yeah, yeah. Like, during the 80s when the boomers were controlling the music industry, it was like, okay, I won't watch TV. I'll go have healthy pastimes because I don't get to control my own pop culture, until Nirvana takes over, it's all boomer stuff and might as well just tune it out and go, learn my own stuff. Probably a gift, really,
I think
in a weird way.
it does talk about that in that book, and I've always kind of felt that way, for sure. So maybe you'll come back and we can do
That'd be great.
Kurt's
Thank you.
part together, uh,
Thank you.
and like the whole Gen X movement. So everyone, thank you for watching. Please check out Nick's work. Check out when his software is released, which is going to be coming soon. I'll put links to everything below. And if you want a reading from him, I think I'm going to get one.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
hopefully
good.
for that.
Yes, I'm offering because I need some time to work on Nechepso astrology software, which we'll be announcing within about a week or so, the launching date, but it'll be soon in the next few weeks. But yeah, I'm available for readings, and because I need to save up a little money to work on the software, I'm offering a rebate, a 25% rebate on 1 hour consultations. So if you want to book a reading with me at nickdagenbestastrologer.com/consultations. So if you go to
Find it.
nickdagenbestastrologer.com, that's my website, click the consultations tab and the promo code Uranus, all caps, Uranus. That'll get you 25% off my regular price for 1 hour consultations. And that's on till June 20th. So yeah, come check it out.
I'm going to check it out. Okay. Well,
Great.
so thank you everyone for your time. There is a
Thank you.
reason and a season for it all. The cosmos is conspiring to help us even in challenging times. And I do appreciate you're really breaking it down for us in such a fascinating way. So, all right. Until next time, stargazers.